Olav Breskin had been senior trainer at the Tarvian country stables for 45 years, and on the Friday afternoon, the young assistant came down the long aisle to him with her cap in both hands. He knew, before she had said one word, that she had something to tell him he did not want to hear and would, in the end, be grateful for. Senna Varan was 25 years old, 3 months into her work at the stables, hired to muck the lesser stalls and exercise the older mares. She stood in front of him in her dark working trousers and her long-sleeved cotton shirt and her plain canvas vest, her dark hair in its low bun, and she said, "Mr. Breskin, sir, I would like to ask Don Tarvian for 5 minutes of his time." "Through you, if you will." Olav had a sour answer half-formed and he swallowed it, because the girl's eyes were level and her hands were steady, and she had not come down the long aisle to him with anything frivolous in 3 months. He said, "About what child?" "Voltarin," she said. "I think I have seen something about Voltarin, sir." Voltarin was the prized stallion at the end of the long aisle. He had been Don Tarvian's late father's last colt, foaled 14 years before, and now, finally, prepared for a high-value sale to a buyer in another country whose deposit was already on the table. The inspection was in 2 weeks. 3 credentialed equine veterinarians had been brought in across the last month, the country's best men Olav himself had recommended, to find the cause of a small change in the stallion's gait that had begun in the last 6 weeks to embarrass the family's senior trainer in front of his own employer for the first time in his life. Imaging, blood work, a bone scan from a clinic in the capital, nothing. The vets were stumped. The family's name in the equine world was a quiet, careful thing, built across 2 generations, and it was, in the way of careful things, 2 weeks from being damaged. Olav looked at the girl a long moment. He said, "Have you laid a hand on the horse?" "No, sir, I have not. It is not my place to. I have only watched him from the aisle as I go about my duties." "How many times have you watched him?" "4 times a day, sir, for 3 months." Olav had counted that himself. He had not known she had counted it too. "And what have you seen?" "He shifts his weight off the front left when he is standing at rest, sir. He has been doing it more the last 6 weeks. The vets have not seen him at rest the way I see him at rest. They see him on the lunge line or on the imaging table. I see him on the 3rd walk of my morning." Olav drew a slow breath through his nose. He said, "What do you think you would find, child, if you laid your hand on him?" "A soft tissue thing in the frog of the front left, sir," she said. "Early. The kind my grandfather had a name for that does not show on imaging because it is in the soft outer layer. I'm not promising you, sir. I may be wrong. But I would like to ask the Don for 5 minutes, and if he will, for permission to lay my hand on the horse." "Your grandfather," Olav said. "He trained workhorses in the mountains, sir, for 2 generations. He taught me by hand." Olav had been the boy of an old horseman himself, before the world had moved on from such men. He looked at this girl in her plain vest and her low bun, and he knew, with the slow certainty of a man who had served one family for half a century, that he had been mucking the lesser stalls with a horsewoman for 3 months, and had not asked her a single question. "You will have 5 minutes tomorrow morning, child," he said. "At the hour the Don finishes his coffee, I will tell him myself." She inclined her head once, and went back down the long aisle to her bucket. Olav walked up to the great house that evening, and he stood in the corridor outside Don Tarvian's study and waited until the Don raised his eyes from the papers on his desk. Don Adriano Tarvian was 42 years old, head of the family 7 years, tall and broad-shouldered in his charcoal 3-piece suit, his short dark hair graying lightly at the temples, his neatly trimmed dark beard, his piercing dark eyes very steady. He had been his late father's son in the stables all his boyhood, and he kept the country stables now at considerable cost out of devotion. Olav knew what Voltarin was to him, and he knew the man would let no horse of his late father's be sold poorly. "Don Tarvian," Olav said, "the young assistant who mucks the lesser stalls has asked for 5 minutes tomorrow morning." "About what, Olav?" "About Voltarin's front left, sir. She thinks she may see something the vets have not." The Don set his pen down. He looked at Olav for a long, quiet moment. He did not laugh, he did not dismiss it. He said, "Bring her at the hour I finish my coffee. Bring whatever she wishes to bring." She came in at the hour. She did not bring slides. She brought a small, clean piece of paper with 3 sentences written in her own neat hand, and a pair of hoof picks of the old kind her grandfather had made for her by his own forge, their wooden handles worn smooth by 2 generations of palms. She laid the paper on the table. She laid the picks beside it. She said plainly, "Don Tarvian, sir, I believe the cause is a soft tissue problem in the inner part of the front left hoof, the frog. It does not show on imaging because it is in the soft outer layer of the tissue. My grandfather taught me to read it by the way the horse shifts at rest, and by the small heat difference one can feel through the bare palm laid against the inner heel. I have not laid my hand on Voltaren, sir, because it is not my place to. But if you would permit, I would like to. I am not promising you, I may be wrong. The Don read the 3 sentences on the paper. He looked at the hoof picks. He picked one up and felt the weight of it in his hand, and he set it back down on the table beside the other. He looked at Senna Verand a long, quiet moment. He stood. Walk with me, Miss Verand. He walked the long aisle with her himself. Olav came 2 steps behind. At Voltaren's stall the Don stopped, set his hand on the door for a breath and said, "Olav, stand back, please." Olav stood back. The Don nodded once to the assistant. She entered the stall. She did not speak to the horse, and she did not need to. She laid her bare palm against the inner heel of the stallion's front left hoof, and she held it there for a slow count, longer than Olav had expected. Voltaren let her. He did not so much as flick his ear. Then she took up the hoof pick, the old-style pick her grandfather had made for her, and she worked gently for a count Olav lost track of past 10 minutes. She did not pry, she did not dig. She felt with the pick the way an old horseman feels with the pick, a millimeter at a time, the way Olav had seen done by his own master 60 years before and not since. She found it. She said quietly without turning, "There is a thickening in the frog tissue at the medial heel, Don Tarvian, small, I would call it early. My grandfather had a name for it. It is not in any book that I have seen." The Don did not move. He said, "Olav, get Bertram on the line." Bertram was the most respected farrier in the country. Olav had used his name as a benchmark for 40 years and had never had cause to ring him. He went to the office in the tack room and rang. Bertram came by helicopter that afternoon. He was a small, wiry man in his 60s with hands like polished wood. He spoke to no one when he arrived. He went straight to Voltaren's stall, knelt and laid his own hand against the same heel for a slow count. He took up his own pick. He worked for 15 minutes. He stood, dusted his trousers, and walked out of the stall and across the aisle to where Don Tarvian was waiting with Olav and the young assistant. He said, "It is what the young woman said. Early, but it is there. Treatable, 3 months of the right care, a careful trim every 10 days, and the right poultice. He will be sound by the autumn. I would not let him be inspected in 2 weeks. He would not pass an inspection of a man who knew where to look." Don Tarvian inclined his head to the farrier. He turned to the young assistant. He inclined his head to her very slightly as one horseman to another. He said, "Miss Verand, thank you." "Don Tarvian," she said. That was all that was said in the aisle. In the office afterward, the Don sat down at the small desk and wrote, in his own hand, a letter to the foreign buyer. He informed the buyer plainly that the stallion required a treatment course before the family would, in good conscience, hand him over, that the family covered the deposit's interest costs out of its own funds for the season, that the family offered the buyer a refundable hold at the original price if the buyer wished, with no penalty for withdrawal. He signed it himself. He had the letter sent through proper channels the same afternoon. The buyer wrote back within the week and accepted the hold. The buyer wrote, in fact, that he had not expected so honest an answer from any seller in his 30 years in the trade, and that he would be there in the autumn with his check if the horse was sound. The horse was treated. Olav supervised the trims himself. The young assistant came and laid her bare palm against the inner heel once a week, on a Friday afternoon at the Don's request. By the autumn the stallion's gait was clean, and Bertram came back by helicopter and signed his name to a sheet of paper that said as much. The inspector arrived in October. The sale closed at full price plus a modest premium because the family's name in the equine world had, in the quiet way these things move, been enhanced. The buyer shook Don Tarvian's hand at the gate and said, "If you ever sell another, I will come." The Don did not promote the young assistant loudly. He promoted her on her own terms. He came down to the tack room one afternoon in late October with Olav at his shoulder. He sat down across from Senna Verand at the small wooden table where the bridles were oiled, and he laid out a contract he had written himself in plain language. He read it aloud to her. The terms were these. She was to be made the stable's youngest resident trainer, on a salary the small mountain village she had come from would not believe. She was to have her own room above the tack room, with a window that looked over the long stable aisle. She was to have her grandfather's name on the staff register beneath her own, as her credentialed teacher, with no further explanation needed. and she was to have, in the contract, a clause she could read herself that said her hours and her methods were her own, and would not be questioned by anyone in the house. She read the contract aloud back to him. She took the day to think. She signed it on the Saturday morning. Olav signed his name as witness. His hand trembled very slightly, and when he had set the pen down, he turned aside and walked out of the tack room and across to the empty straw stall at the end of the aisle and stood with his back to the door and wept once in private, for the first time in 45 years. He had served one family for half a century, and he had not known until that Saturday morning that he had been waiting all his life to see a master horsewoman come back into a stable that had forgotten the old ways. He composed himself. He blew his nose. He walked back to the tack room. The Don wrote her one handwritten note, on a small sheet of plain cream paper, the day she signed. Miss Verand, it read, "Thank you for laying your hand on the horse my father loved. Your grandfather raised a good one, a Tarvian." She kept the note in the drawer of the small writing desk in her room above the tack room. She did not show it to anyone. She sent her grandfather, who lived in a small 2-room cottage in the mountains, the first month of her salary, by money order, with a letter in her own hand that said only that he had been right about the old way and that she was well. The slow grace, the thing the Don did not court and did not name, came on across the winter. He began to find reasons to be at the stables, not many at first. A Saturday morning here, a Tuesday evening there. He would come to the tack room and sit on the low stool by the door while she oiled bridles, and he would ask her about her grandfather and about the kind of pick the old man had made by his own forge, and about the names in the old language for the things the books did not say. She answered him plainly. She did not flatter him. She did not pretend warmth she did not feel. She taught him when he asked, the way she had been taught, by hand, by patience, by the small things books did not say. He learned to lay his own hand against the inner heel. He learned the way a horse shifts his weight when he is at rest. He learned to be quiet enough to be told things by an animal that did not speak. He did not court her, he listened. By the next spring, on a Sunday afternoon in late March, he asked her plainly, with Olav within earshot in the next stall, whether she would consider coming up to the great house for a Sunday supper, only that to meet his mother. She told him she would. She came up to the house in her own plain navy dress and a clean white collar and her hair in its low bun. The supper was quiet. There were 4 of them at the long table, the Don, the matriarch, the young assistant, and an old aunt who said almost nothing. The matriarch, who was 70 years old and the family's reigning moral center, took both Senna Varen's hands in her own at the doorway when supper was over, and she looked at her a long moment with eyes very steady, and she said, "Miss Verand, I have been wanting, for some weeks now, to meet the woman who taught my son how to listen. You are welcome in this house. Come again when you wish." Senna Verand inclined her head. She walked back down the long path to the tack room in the dusk with her own hands very still by her sides. Olav, who had been waiting at the tack room door because he had not been able to keep himself from waiting, said only, "How was supper, child?" "Quiet, Mr. Breskin," she said. "It was quiet." "Good," Olav said. "That is the only way a thing of this kind ought to be." He turned out the tack room light himself that night. He walked down the long aisle to Voltarin's stall in the dark. The stallion stood easy on all 4 feet, his weight balanced, his old eye half closed against the lamp at the end of the row. Olav laid his hand briefly on the door of the stall, the way Don Tarvian's late father had taught him to lay a hand on the door of any horse he loved, and he stood there a long, quiet moment. He would say much later, when he was asked, that there had been nothing dramatic in any of it, no grand speech, no scene, no thunderclap. There had been a girl with a low bun who came down a long aisle with her cap in both hands. There had been a feared man plain in his charcoal suit who had set down his pen and stood up and walked the aisle with her. There had been a stallion at the end of the row, his weight finally even, his old eye half closed. There had been a handwritten note in a drawer. There had been a matriarch's 2 hands on a young woman's 2 hands at a doorway. The house had become, in the most ordinary and the most uncoerced way, whole. Outside the tack room window, the small lamp above the long aisle burned warm and steady, and the wind moved the chestnut tree by the wall the way it had moved the chestnut tree for 60 years.